And then this one. Okay, we come to the last major, this is a big segment of the book, but it has to be treated as a block. There's no way to separate the materials here. Ezekiel 40 to 48 kind of resembles what you find in Exodus 25 to 40. It's all about temple, just like Exodus. The second half of the book is all about tabernacle. But this is not just about temple, it's a little bit beyond that. But it's also the longest block of prophecy anywhere in the Bible that was never fulfilled. And perhaps as we go through, you will see why, which raises an important question about prophecy and prophets, that being a prophet is not about whether your prophecy is realized or not. It's more about the message that God gives, regardless of whether there is a fulfillment to it, whether there's a response to it or not. And so this is one case where that becomes an issue, because the prophecy was never fulfilled in any period of history as such. And so we need to keep that in mind as we go through. Many OT scholars talk about the futuristic temple of Ezekiel. So we're going to use that phrase that is known. So it's mostly about the temple and everything surrounding the temple. So there's a little bit more than just temple description. However, there's some unique features in these chapters, particularly in relationship to the temple. For example, there is a river that comes out of this temple with trees lining its banks. And the only other place where you have a similar picture is in Revelation 22. And then we are told that these trees bear fruit every single month. You know, I have a mango tree outside, but it only bears fruit maybe, well, it should be starting sometime around now during the hot season of the year. And again, the only other place in the Bible where you meet trees bearing fruit every month is in Revelation. The temple, or rather the city that surrounds the temple, has 12 gates, and the gates are named after the 12 tribes of Israel. We will see a bit of a hybrid with regards to the names of the tribes. Again, we have an almost exact replication in Revelation 21. We shall go through them one by one. The priests here are said to be descendants of Zadok. Most of us may not remember who Zadok is, but he's mentioned twice in this segment, so it's apparently quite important. The chapters also speak about tribal land allotments, which sounds very much like the book of Joshua from chapter 13 to 19 and so on. But unlike Joshua, where the allotment of land is a bit fluid, here in Ezekiel, the land allotment is very, very precise. And we will see some maps as we go along that attempt to capture this. What is different here from any other Old Testament material is what is called a holy district. And this sounds a little bit, again, like Revelation, but it's a little bit different from that as well. So there are some things in here that seems to echo some things in Revelation, but also seems to echo some Old Testament material as well. So let's go through them unit by unit. Chapters 40 to 42 talk about, first of all, the temple walls. And what's interesting about these temple walls is that they are described in language that makes them a cube. It says that their length, their breadth, and their height is the same. Now, these are giant temple walls. If the breadth or the thickness of the wall is more than 3 meters, and the height is more than 3 meters, and the length is 3 meters, it's a pretty heavy wall. But of course, when you look at those figures mathematically, we're talking here about a cube. And there are only 2 other places in the Bible where this geometric figure of the cube appears, and that is the Holy of Holies in Exodus, the tabernacle, and the New Jerusalem in Revelation. So you can see there's something happening in Ezekiel, and maybe why the prophecies are not been fulfilled or have not been fulfilled yet. It does talk about outer and inner courtyards, and this kind of resembles more the Temple of Solomon, because this does not exist with the tabernacle, and it's not part of the Revelation vision. Now, these courtyards have 3 gates each, and the distance between the gates is 53 meters. So we're talking about a lot of very large dimensions here. Now, there are only 3 gates, east, north, and south. There's no gate on the west because that would be the back side of the temple. This is similar to Solomon's temple and to the tabernacle as well. And you can see this if you compare it with Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 6. Again, you have only those 3 sides. The tabernacle, but especially the temples, they faced east. And so the main entrance would be from the east, but because of the size of the precinct, they added a north and a south gate, but they never added a west gate because that would be from the rear of the temple, and you do not come into God's presence from the backside. You have to enter through the main door. What is similar here to Solomon's temple are the special rooms. We do not have this with the tabernacle, and you can see why. It all had to do with spaces. There are special rooms for preparing the sacrifices. That was not there in Solomon's temples. There were storerooms in Solomon's temple, but there were rooms for priests. We're not sure why, apparently for them to prepare themselves ritually, to get dressed up, or whatever reason, or maybe even take a nap between shifts so that they don't have to travel too much. The inner courtyard is intriguing because it is a square, 53 by 53 meters, okay, which does not fit the Temple of Solomon or does not fit the tabernacle. Everything about the tabernacle of Moses comes in, just a minute, it comes in a rectangular form. However, if you look at the dimensions of the New Jerusalem, then the base would be a square, okay? So the New Jerusalem is both a cube and a square, and you find a cube and a square being mentioned here. The dimensions are actually given. Of course, they're not given in meters. This is converted, an approximate conversion. They were given in cubits, okay, which is the way that they measured anything in Old Testament times, even to some extent in the New Testament times. However, there is a problem because they had different cubits. The Egyptians had their own cubits, the Israelites had their own cubits, the Babylonians had their own cubits, and there were a few centimeters difference between them. But on average, a cubit is measured as the distance between your tallest finger and your elbow. Now, apparently, the Israelites, who were largely shorter in terms of height than, say, the Egyptians, their cubit was a little bit shorter. So there were some of these differences to keep in mind. It also describes the temple proper, and that in this temple proper, there were 2 rooms. The outer sanctuary, which is called consistently temple, uses the Hebrew word for temple, hekal, in Ezekiel. It doesn't use the tabernacle language or Solomon's temple language of holy room or holy place. The inner sanctuary has 2 names in Ezekiel. The first name you meet is simply called the within. Not exactly sure what that means. This is a totally new label that you don't meet anywhere in the historical text or the Torah. And then it's also called the holiness. It's not called the Holy of Holies, like the tabernacle of Moses. It's simply called the holiness. It's a very strong noun, which immediately implies the presence of God. The outer sanctuary has these dimensions. 21 by 10.6. It's a rectangle. The same is true with the tabernacle of Moses, which is also a rectangle, but much smaller. The inner sanctuary is square. And if the height is the same, which it probably is based on other calculations, then the inner sanctuary is also a cube, like the inner sanctuary or the Holy of Holies of Moses' tabernacle and the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple. When Solomon built his temple, he had to raise the platform for the Holy of Holies to make sure that the cube is maintained. So length, width, and height must be exactly the same. And so we anticipate, even though it's not stated here, only the floor plan is given, square, that it would have been a cube as well, which would mean that the height of this temple would have been about 11 meters. So we're talking here about a fairly gigantic structure. It's about 11 meters long, 11 meters wide, and about 11 meters high. That would be roughly the height of a 3-story building, or perhaps even more, because the average height of, I don't know about Hong Kong, but in Thailand, the average height of a floor is about 3 meters, say like the house in which I'm living. So 11 meters would be about 3.5 floors almost. So we're talking here about a gigantic structure. It would be that big and that small as well. I mean, that long and that wide. Multiple rooms are mentioned, but also multiple courtyards. Now, interestingly, the multiple courtyards is more like Herod's temple than Solomon's temple. And so we need to keep this in mind. But Solomon's temple had at least 2 courtyards, an outer and an inner one. Herod's temple had the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, and the court of Israel, and then the court of the priests. So at least 4 courtyards in Herod's temple. And then, of course, these priestly rooms that are described, which we are unclear as to their actual functions. In chapter 43, he describes something that was seen only twice in biblical history. In Exodus 40, at the dedication of the tabernacle, and in 1 Kings 8, at the dedication of Solomon's temple. In all 3 stories, as well as here in Ezekiel 43, God descended in the form of smoke and cloud on his holy place. And that was so thick that no one could go in. So neither Moses nor Aaron nor anybody else could go into the tabernacle while that cloud covered the tabernacle. The same thing happened during Solomon's temple. No one could go inside. It was fully covered by this cloud. And the same thing is happening in this temple. Now, in all 3 stories, the cloud represents the glory of God, not just his presence, the glory of God. And you see cloud as one of the elements found in every description of God's throne room. And so the picture we have here is clearly God's, here's Moses, God's throne room. So there are similarities, but there are also differences to these other structures dealing with the house of God. So we need to keep this in mind as we move along through the text. Now, interestingly, Ezekiel was told to write down everything that he saw. All the instructions about the priests and their duties, it's all coming up. The only other person who was given similar instructions was Moses. In fact, Moses was told to write all those instructions in a book and to place that book in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, many people think that the Ark of the Covenant contains the 10 Commandments. Well, what it actually contains are 2 fairly large tablets on which the covenant terms are written, the 10 Commandments just being part of those covenant terms. Because the Hebrew about Moses says that he had to write on every surface, which means front and back and probably even along the sides. And why would it take him 40 days to write something if it was just the 10 Commandments? And so Ezekiel is being given the same instruction. So there's an echo here between what Moses had to do for the first time in Israel's or biblical history and what Ezekiel is being told to do. So it's like he's writing a new set of covenant terms. And he is told that this would be the new temple Torah. And it uses the actual Hebrew word, as Sankey can attest, the word Torah is being used here. Look at what the text says. This is the law, the Hebrew word is Torah, of the house upon the top of the mountain. Remember, Solomon built his temple on the top of the mountain, one of the highest hills in southern Israel. All territory, and here is where it gets interesting. I'm giving you a very literal translation. All territory surrounding, the Hebrew word means round and round, is holiness of holinesses. Now, we cannot do that in English. So it's implying that this is absolute holiness. And then it ends up by the same line as the opening verse. Pay attention, for this is the Torah of the house. Now, Solomon's temple came to be known as the house of the Lord. And that language is being applied here. We meet something similar about this house, this place where God resides, and the mountaintop in Revelation 21. That New Jerusalem, God's new residence, will also reside on a mountaintop. Solomon's temple is on a mountaintop. When Moses first got the vision about the tabernacle, he was on a mountaintop. Okay, so you have all those elements that are being used in this text. And then we have a description of the altar. It's the only furniture described in this temple, unlike Solomon's temple or Moses' tabernacle. But this altar is gigantic. It's about 6.5 meters by 6.5 meters and about 3 meters high. They had to build a staircase for the priest to go up. Even Moses' tabernacle was pretty big. Moses' tabernacle, the altar, is about 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. So that was a pretty big place as well. Solomon built an even bigger altar, and here we find a gigantic one. Imagine what 6 by 6 by 3 or 6.5 by 6.5 by 3, what that would be like. Most of us don't even live in houses this big. Okay. And so it's quite an amazing piece of furniture. Now, nothing is said here about any other furniture in those inside rooms. Okay, only this piece of furniture is described, and in fairly great detail. Chapter 44 goes off into the peoples and the lands. So first we read some instructions about the prince. And the description about this prince here has echoes in Revelation 4 and 5. Then we have a description of the priestly duties and their responsibilities. Again, the echoes here are two ways: to the Torah in describing the priests and their work, and the 24 elders in Revelations 4 and 5. You can see what happens when we get to Revelation. Revelation is replicating the pattern that we first meet here in Ezekiel. Then it talks about the Levites, their duties and responsibilities, again echoing the Torah, but also being echoed in the description of work and appearance of the 144,000 in Revelation 7 and 14. So you're beginning to see how important the book of Ezekiel is to understanding Revelation, and vice versa, far more than anything we can find in Daniel. Now, here's a mystery. Why mention that the priests were descendants of Zadok? A question here is, who is Zadok? Well, Zadok was the 9th descendant from Phinehas. Phinehas was the son of Eleazar, and Eleazar was the son of Aaron. Okay, so there's a line. Why didn't it say that these are descendants of Aaron? Because the whole line comes from Aaron. Till today, there are Jews who believe they are from the house of Aaron. They call themselves the Kohanim. I met one of those in Israel on my last trip there. What is interesting about Zadok is that he was the real high priest of Solomon's temple, or rather the first high priest of Solomon's temple. And so now that Ezekiel is talking about a temple, and Ezekiel has watched in vision, he has heard the reports of how the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple. So the name of Zadok becomes important. But the meaning of the name also matters, because Zadok is derived from the Hebrew word Tzedek, which means righteous. Here it's in nominal form, meaning the righteous one. And again, this would strike in future echoes in the book of Hebrews and materials about Christ. In the songs in Revelation, you may not realize this, there are approximately 25 songs in Revelation, actually more than prophecies. In the book of Revelation, every song describes about the righteousness of the work of Christ and the work of God through Christ, whether it is in winning a battle, or in bringing redemption through his personal sacrifice, or in establishing order in the world. Just and righteous are your ways is a refrain that appears again and again. And so we can see that since Jesus is presented in the New Testament as the true high priest, we can see why Zadok is being chosen here as the symbol for what will happen in Revelation. And then, of course, we have this bunch of rules about priests, which are really almost the same as the ones in Exodus and Leviticus. And when you read those two sets of materials, Torah and Ezekiel, you can see that the format may have changed, but the idea of the priesthood remains very much intact. Okay, here's a little bit of an artist's impression of this temple. 3 parts to it: the courtyard, the outer courtyard, the inner courtyard, and then the temple proper with the what we would call the holy place, the temple, and the holiness place, the Holy of Holies, as we call it. And you can see by this, there's no entrance from here, but there's entrance from south, east, and north. So you've got all these storage rooms. You even have descriptions about kitchen. You have chambers for the priests and special kitchens for the priests. And you have some extra building at the back here. They're not even sure why that is for. Even in the inner courtyard, you have the parallel of the outer courtyard, 3 entrances as well. So here is the altar, this gigantic altar. And here is the holy, and then the Holy of Holies. In Ezekiel, it's called temple, Hekal, and it's called Kodesh, holiness. So it's a little different labeling from the Temple of Solomon or the Tabernacle of Moses. But this should give you a sense of proportion. When you look at the size of all of these places, here is Moses' tabernacle. Here is Solomon's temple. You can see it's almost twice the size. Here is King Herod's temple. This is the one that Jesus saw. I mean, we're talking about the entire precinct, not just the tabernacle itself or the temple itself. You can see that it is 3 times the size of these two combined. Okay, but here's the size of Ezekiel's temple. Now, those of you, if you have ever watched American football, this is an American-based diagram. I should do one of my own, but I was too lazy to do. An American football field is about this size. It's about 1.5 times the size of Solomon's temple precinct. Okay, but put all of these inside this gigantic futuristic temple of Ezekiel, and they would all fit in there, and there would still be a great deal of empty space everywhere. Now, when you compare the inner building itself, okay, here is the temple proper. Here is Solomon's temple proper. Here is the tabernacle proper. Give me a second. There's some. Okay, I think this must be Judy's friend. Right, Judy? Okay. And here's Herod's temple. Notice that Herod's temple has a slightly different shape from either of these, which are perfectly rectangular. And here is his temple. You can see that the building itself is larger than all of these, maybe equivalent to the size of Herod's temple. So here's the thing. It echoes all of these previous structures, but it also seems to be looking forward to some new ones coming up. So some people have suggested that Herod's temple is kind of a partial fulfillment of Ezekiel's temple. We're talking about several centuries between Herod's temple and Ezekiel's temple. But when you look carefully at Herod's temple, there are many differences from this. In terms of basic layout, it is closer to Solomon's and the tabernacle. Herod's temple had some unique features, plus the fact that it had on its western wall, on one of the walls, this Roman army barracks right next to the temple, which would not be tolerated in any of these other structures. Okay, so that's the temple size. So why in the world is Ezekiel shown this gigantic, enormous temple, and yet it's never been fulfilled? When we look at the height of the walls, then we have to assume that this entire structure is a cube as well. Now, it's not very clear from the text, but seems to imply that it is. And so the only place where that would be true of this gigantic, enormous temple precinct would be the New Jerusalem, which is even larger, but it's also a cube. Definitely the base is a square. So what we're seeing in Ezekiel is both past and future. And that makes it very, very intriguing as to what is really happening in this prophecy. All right, in chapters 45 to 46, it's all about the land, how the 12 tribes, the land's being divided, but also a part of the land will be reserved for Yahweh. This is the holy district thing, and then land for the temple. And when you look at the lands being assigned to Yahweh, we're talking about 13 by 11 kilometers long and wide. The temple land, which is only about less than 3 meters within that land of Yahweh. But this is very similar to how Joshua talks about the land with regards to the 12 tribes. Now, there was no temple in Joshua's time, so it would only have something to do with the 12 tribes. Unlike Joshua 13 to 19, the priests are given their own land here. And the Levites are given their own land here. You know that in the settlement of the Israelites after they left Egypt, they were given certain cities of refuge in which to live, but no actual land for themselves. Notice that the priests were given much more land than the Levites, when in actual reality, with Old Testament history, there were more Levites than priests. And when you read the descriptions carefully, these two lands do not overlap. Unlike in the Old Testament, prior to Ezekiel, where priests and Levites, their lands kind of overlap. So there is difference between the two views. And then there is land for a city. So within this land of Yahweh, there would be the temple land, which includes land for the temple proper, and land for the priests and the Levites, and then there would be land for a city. It paints the picture of two adjacent realities, the temple and the city side by side. And then it talks about offerings and festivals. It actually names some of them. It talks about the new moon festivals. It talks about the New Year festival, most likely a reference to Yom Kippur, because it says the 7th day of the 10th month, and that is Yom Kippur. It talks about Shabbats, and you know from Leviticus that there are multiple Sabbaths in the Bible. And then it talks about Pesach, which is Passover, and Sukkot, which is shelters. Now, if this is true, then these three, Yom Kippur, Pesach, and Shelters, are still the three dominant festivals in Judaism until today. And Shabbats, of course, there's a lot of things covered there. Now, there were three kinds of Shabbats in Leviticus. Shabbat that came every week, Shabbat that came annually. So Yom Kippur, Pesach, Sukkot, they're all called Sabbaths. And then Shabbat that came once in a while. There was a Shabbat year, for example, once every 7 years. There was a Shabbat called Yobel, or Jubilee in English, that came once in 50 years. And so it's probably referring to all of those. And there are instructions about Sabbath, just like you find in Leviticus. But please keep in mind that Sabbath here is not talking about the weekly Sabbath. It's a generic term for all these Sabbaths that you have that were seen in the Torah and that are taken for granted here. And this is one that's interesting because even in Solomon's temple, you don't find this. Temple kitchen instructions. Once a month, I go to this Chinese church at Permsin Road behind Don Muang Airport. And one of the nice things about that church is they have a fairly large kitchen and dining hall. So they don't have potluck. They have some volunteers, and maybe they even give them some money, who work and prepare food in that kitchen. This is the kind of picture we have about the tabernacle and the temple. They did cooking. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but the Torah and also the historical books speak about how when they celebrate Passover and Sukkot, in Passover, they had to eat the Passover meal. And you cannot prepare that outside the temple. It has to be done within that holy place. And so they had cooking pots and fires all around the temple area. In this temple, you have kitchens for that. But you have something here that doesn't relate to any prior Old Testament materials, but only with New Testament material. It speaks about a healing river that originates from the holiness place. In other words, from the Holy of Holies. This river flows out and then it spreads out throughout all this territory and it rejuvenates the earth. Everywhere it flows, it transforms everything. And along the banks of the river, there are fruit trees that provide fruit every month. And then it uses a language that is replicated almost verbatim in Revelation. It says that the leaves of these trees are for the healing of the people, have healing properties. Now, the only other place in the Bible that has a similar picture is Revelation, where the river of life flows from the throne of God and flows out in all directions. And there is the tree of life, which in Revelation gives us a very difficult description that the tree has its trunks on both sides of the river, forming almost like a tree tunnel, like the one they have in Moklek, beautiful tree tunnel. And that its fruit appears every month in Revelation, a different fruit every month, but the leaves are for the healing of the nations. So what you read about the New Jerusalem in Revelation, almost the majority of the symbols in that city come from Ezekiel. And we get so much more mileage if we read Ezekiel first and understand Ezekiel and then read Revelation. Because Revelation it's like piggyback on this. All the symbols are coming out from here, particularly this element. And here's where we get something interesting. It gives us the boundaries of this new land. North from Mediterranean to Hazar Enan. I'll show you a map. East from Hazar Enan along the River Jordan to a place called Tamar. South from Tamar to Kadesh to the river of Egypt, most probably a reference to the Nile and to the Mediterranean. And then the entire west is the Mediterranean Sea. So let's have a look at some maps to try and understand this. When God promise a land to Abraham, he also drew boundaries in Genesis chapters 13 and 15. And this is the land, look carefully at the map. This is the land that God promised Abraham. Not the land that everybody's fighting over now, or even the land that Joshua and his people had. The land that was promised to Abraham covered the entire Middle East as we know it today. God told Israel, from the river to the sea, by the way, the great river, Euphrates, from the river of Egypt to the sea, from the desert to the Hermon Range. Okay, now this land in Ezekiel is different. If you follow the purple line, this is the new land that has been given. If you follow the green color, that's the land that Joshua and the Israelites took possession of. So here's the land that God promised Israel. Never became a reality. You may not know this, but when the British Mandate decided what land to give this new fledgling nation of Israel, they actually originally, by not the British, sorry, the League of Nations, okay, in 27, sorry, the League of Nations actually gave us land for the new nation of Israel, all of this that you see here. But then in 1930, the British Mandate decided, let's split the land and give this side east of the Jordan to the Arabs and west of the Jordan to the Jews. And then from there, all the mess happened. The Israelites, even at the time of Solomon, extended the land only a little bit, maybe up here, and a little bit to the south, all the way down to the Red Sea. Okay, this area. But at the time of when Joshua died, they only had this green ocean. Notice that part of it is in today's Jordan, part of it is today's Lebanon, and then Israel. This new land covers part of Egypt, part of Jordan, part of Iraq, part of Syria, most of Iraq, most of Lebanon as part of this new land. And so you can see why, from an Israel's point of view, there is so much heartache about the land. This is what God has promised. And this is what Ezekiel prophesies. This is why there are Christians who believe that this will be fulfilled in our times. This reclaiming of the land prophesied by Ezekiel, which includes this giant temple that will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, this must become a reality before Jesus can return. Now, Seventh-day Adventists have a little different, more esoteric understanding of history. And so we think that the land is immaterial. But we don't realize that to the covenant of Abraham, the primary covenant in the Bible, the principal element of that covenant, the whole reason why that covenant is so important to Abraham is the promise of the land. Without the promise of the land, Abraham's covenant is just vapor. It has no physical reality. Okay, and so God gives them a land. But it's not just that. Look very carefully at the world. Where was the garden that was said to be the home of Adam and Eve? Well, we're told that there were 4 major rivers flowing out from that garden. One is the Euphrates, the other one is the Tigris, and these names are actually used in the Hebrew Bible. The other 2 rivers are called the Pihon and Gishon. And many Old Testament scholars believe, as I do, that one of those names refers to the Jordan, the other to the Nile, which means that the Bible story has always been situated in this part of the world. This is somewhere where the Garden of Eden was. Now, the Garden of Eden must have been a gigantic place. Furthermore, when Noah's descendants left Mount Ararat, which is further north up here, they actually settled down here, this area known as the Shinar. And when God called Abraham, who came from down here, he pulled him out of the Shinar and brought him to Canaan and said, now this is all your land. So his travels was actually marking property. In the Khasi Hills, I think they may still do this, but when I was a kid, people would plant pine trees and make a land claim by planting pine trees. Abraham's journeys were not the journeys of a nomad. They were the journeys of a man being asked to mark out his land. So his journey into Egypt was not simply because of the famine. It was helping to mark out that land as well. Unfortunately, the Israelites, after their Egypt experience, only managed to claim a tiny piece of that land. Never went beyond to claim the whole land before the Arab situation appeared on the scene. This is something nearly 1500 years before there was people or a religion that we know of today. And so here you have a problem. If people actually believe this is going to happen, and I have a feeling some of those right-wing Israelis who are propping up the Israeli government right now, they probably believe this prophecy is going to come true. There are some rabbis who are spouting this prophecy as well. Okay. And even the New Testament says that the New Jerusalem, Zechariah says, and it's backed up by some New Testament inferences, that the New Jerusalem will land here in the Old Jerusalem area. Of course, it's gigantic, so it probably fill all of this area. Why is all of biblical history situated around this part of the world? And that is an amazing thing. Ezekiel does not change that, neither does the New Testament. So even the church begins in this area and then spread out to all the world. This is God's garden land. And you have songs in Isaiah, in other prophets, here in Ezekiel, in the New Testament, of how the land will be completely transformed by this river of life, by this setting up of the kingdom of the Messiah. Something for us to think about. Those Manipuri people, the so-called Manas tribe, who call themselves after Manasseh, who believe they are one of the lost tribes and are trying very hard to be relocated to the land of Israel. Maybe they have a point. And we have seen how modern Israel brought the land back to life. The modern state of Israel has made the Negev a farmland, which is all desert in most biblical history. The Gaza Strip became a huge farming experiment. It was so successful that much of the food is being grown here. When Israel left in 2005 and Hamas was voted in office in 2007, the first thing they did was to destroy all of those farms, destroy all of the greenhouses and everything that the Israelis had left behind. They could have made a Eastern Mediterranean Riviera. This is the richest soil in southern Israel, by the way, if you do not know anything about agriculture. Yes, the Galilee area is very rich, but the south here is mostly arid except for the Gaza Strip. And the Hamas and Palestinians have literally destroyed the land. People made so much noise when Israel cut off electricity and water to the Gaza Strip. But what the world does not acknowledge and does not talk about is that Israel was actually supplying free electricity and water to Gaza Strip until October 7. Okay. Because they still see all of this as part of biblical prophecy. And that is why people believe until this is fulfilled, the prophecy will remain an unfulfilled prophecy. All right, let's look at the names of the 12 tribes. Here is where we get into a bit of confusion, because when it describes the land for the 12 tribes, these are the names that are used. And there's no mention of the Levites. okay, or levy, which is parallel to Joshua 13 to 19 with regards to the tribes of Israel. The holy district involves both priests and Levites. This is probably a parallel to the cities of refuge, except in ancient Israel they had 6 cities scattered throughout the land. And so all of those are being compensated in one place. The city gates would be named after the different tribes, but Manasseh and Ephraim are no longer in the picture. And the same picture emerges in Revelation, where the gates of the New Jerusalem carries the names of the 12 tribes. In Revelation, Dan is missing and Ephraim is missing. So notice this carefully. Levi is missing here. Manasseh and Ephraim is missing here. In Revelation, Dan and Ephraim is missing. So there is no common set listing in the Bible of who the 12 tribes are. You know that in Revelation, Joseph becomes a tribe, but Joseph was never a tribe in the Old Testament, but rather 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, here as well as here. And you see that in the Joshua text as well. So there is a bit of a collation of names with regards to these different places. Also, the sequencing here is a little different from a Revelation. Okay, so here's a map of the 12 tribes of Israel and the land that Moses and Joshua had apportioned for the tribes. So, for example, you have this big piece of land belonging to Judah and a little piece for the tribe of Simeon within Judah. Okay, you have Reuben, which is completely on the east side, and then you have these 2 giant pieces of land for Manasseh, but they never actually succeeded in getting any of this. Okay, and then you have Asher, Naphtali, Dan is always the northernmost tiny tribe, Issachar, and you have Gad. By the way, there is archaeological evidence that when the Assyrians destroyed Samaria, the northern kingdom, and exiled the tribes, scattered them around the world, the Gadites ended up in Spain. There are certain islands in Spain, off the coast of Spain, eastern coast of Spain, not far from Tarshish, which is seen as the ends of the world in Bible thought, that those are the Gadites. In fact, if you look at the Spanish names of many places there, they have the Gad element to it. There's a story of how Jesus and his disciples boarded a ship, and there was this gigantic, enormous storm, which is not possible in the Sea of Galilee. And it says in the stories, in all the Gospels, that Jesus was going to the Gadarenes. Gadarenes is New Testament terms for the Gadites, the people of Gad. But there were no Gadarenes anymore in this land at the time of Jesus. And so there is strong archaeological evidence that Jesus and the disciples boarded the Mediterranean Sea all the way to Spain, to these islands where these descendants of Gad lived. Something for us to think about. That storm story could not have happened in the Sea of Galilee. Plus, there's nobody around the Sea of Galilee that could be descendants of the Gad, the tribe of Gad. The people in the group in Manipur believes they are the descendants of Manasseh. He moved all the way east, all the way to India. There is another tribal group in the Pakistan-Afghan border who believe that they are one of the lost tribes as well, though they have not been able to name which tribe they are. Now, in Ezekiel's vision, the division of the land goes like this. So the Jerusalem area is the holy portion or the holy district. This is where the priests, the Levites, the temple will be. And then the tribes, they're just cut straight across the land and given space. What is intriguing about this picture is this reality, that around the holy portion will live the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, the descendants of Rachel. Okay, and so that's a very intriguing picture that you see here. Okay, let's talk about this holy district a little bit. And this is my attempt to diagram. Okay, so I'm not really an artist, but I know how to use figures in PowerPoint and then piece them all together. So the outer areas is what would be called the tribal lands. That would be, the rest of the tribes. The inner area is what would be the land of the prince. So all these open spaces. And then this would be the land of the city. Okay. And this would be the land of the temple. So this is the holy district. Okay. It doesn't include the Levites and the priests will live within this holy district. The temple will be here. Side by side will be the city proper. Now there's open spaces around both the city and the temple. This is the picture he's painting. And the only other place in the Bible that seems to have a similar picture is the New Jerusalem in the new earth, where the peoples will all live outside the city, but the holy city will involve the presence of God and all the 24 elders, the Levites, the angels, and some special people who may live in this city. So the juxtaposition of temple and city here would become one reality in Revelation. What's important is the name given to this city. This is the very last word, or these are the two last words in the book. The name of the city in Hebrew is Yahweh Shammah. Literally, it means Yahweh there. In English, we translate it as the Lord is there, or Yahweh is there, because we need a verb. But here are some comparisons. When God asked Moses to build the tabernacle, he says, have the people of Israel build me a holy sanctuary so I can live among them. In 1 Kings, God said the same thing to Solomon when he was building the temple. I will live among the Israelites and will never abandon my people Israel. This is what hit so hard the Jews when they ended up in Babylon with the captivity. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and we wept. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? All those feelings. And Ezekiel's vision would be like a prophecy to them. All that reality will come back true. Even the glory of God, you will see it again. And in Revelation 21, we have these words. God says, look, the prophet is told, good, look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. All these three texts are embodied in the name Yahweh Shammah. The only place in the Bible where that name is used, but it reflects these three passages, all having to do with the same reality. So when the tabernacle was built, God is there. When Solomon had completed his temple, God is there. When the holy city, Jerusalem, arrives on earth, God is there. And the temple of Ezekiel, Yahweh Shammah, that city next to that temple, tells us that the prince is here, the Messiah is here, the king is here. God is among his people. So what do we have? Well, the first thing we meet in the Bible, in the Torah, is Moses' sanctuary. Notice that we have language, motifs, ideas, descriptions that run across these. Then when we get in the historical texts, Kings and Chronicles, we have a description of Solomon's temple using architectural, conceptual motifs straight out of the sanctuary. When we get into the prophets, we have Ezekiel's temple. This magnificent, this gigantic, this unbuilt temple. When we get into the New Testament, we have not a temple, but a New Jerusalem, which echoes the language of all of these structures. So here's my contention, that Ezekiel is the bridge between the old and the new. Ezekiel shows us that God's physical presence in the desert for the Israelites, in that first stone house during the monarchy period, that these will be fulfilled when God actually brings his temple, his home, to that new creation, to that new heaven and earth. So Ezekiel does two things. He shows us what the future is going to be like. That's why this temple will not be rebuilt. It is a view of that new Jerusalem, but it uses the language of the old temples, because through these previous temples, God showed what it means to have God live among his people. You see, this is the dominant theme of the Bible. And all of this is tied to the land, the same land. Even the New Jerusalem will land on that piece of property. There is something holy about that piece of ground. Maybe this is why everybody wants it. We may not know this, but the Ottoman Turks want it, the Mamluk Empire wanted it, the Caliphate wanted it, the Crusaders wanted it. Okay, the British Empire wanted it. Today, the Palestinians want it. But it only belongs to one reality, Israel. Whether you think of Israel as the physical descendants of Abraham or an extended notion to include Israel as all of Abraham's children, physical and spiritual. One day, all of God's Israel, all of God's people will live in this city and around it in that same land that he has designated as his Eden. You see, Genesis says that God planted a garden in Eden to be man's home. Revelation ends up by telling us God will plant a city as man's new home. And you see, if you study the New Jerusalem in isolation, or Ezekiel's temple in isolation, or Solomon's or Moses' sanctuary in isolation, you don't see the picture. There is one picture that is running through the Bible. When Adam and Eve ate that fruit, they lost their home, they lost their land. The rest of the Bible shows us how God will restore humanity to that land. To me, this is exciting and it's a magnificent picture. God has never moved far from that land. That's why when the Jews were sent to exile, God also sent prophecies and prophets to remind them he will bring them back. There is only one land on this earth that can be called the Holy District of God. It has been from Genesis and it goes all the way to Revelation. So all this historical stuff that has been happening for thousands of years about that land, why that land, the Romans wanted it, the Greeks wanted it, the Persians wanted it, everybody has wanted that land. Because there is the flip side to all of this. Satan's challenge against Christ is a challenge over land, not just about power and kingdom, but over land. When God revealed his plan for this earth, it was more than that being in heaven called Hallel could stand. It's like, how come Adam and Eve are going to get their own land, their own kingdom? Why not me? I'm the best of all your creation. And that's where sin got started. That's why Ezekiel, who shows us the future of this land and this temple, also shows us the past, the origins of sin. The same thing happens in Revelation. We see a picture of the origins of sin and the final conclusion of God. So John Milton, I think, had a point in his epic poems. Paradise lost is paradise regained. Now, whether he understood this had to do with an actual piece of land on earth, probably not. But at least he understood the idea that, you see, salvation will not be complete until that land that God designated as the home for humanity is fully restored. But he doesn't just restore it to the level of the Garden of Eden. He brings an even greater and more magnificent reality. For those of you who may be interested, there are also motif and linguistic links between Genesis, Garden of Eden, and the New Jerusalem and Ezekiel's temple. I didn't include that here because I think it's a lot of intertextual links that will make our minds swim a little bit. But for me, this is the picture. This is what salvation is all about. It doesn't happen unless God lives among his people. It doesn't happen unless the people understand the presence of God and its implications to life. It shows how the lost home of humanity will be returned. So God was not simply sending Abraham into the wild. He took him to the original land. This will be your land. That's where Eden was. That's where the New Jerusalem will descend upon. Nothing changes, only format. So the whole Bible story is tied by two things: the land and these structures, which are both architectural structures as well as cultic structures, showing how God has tied himself to that land. Yes, the whole planet belongs to God, but he doesn't claim the whole planet. God owns all of time, but he only claims one piece of time. The two things of human reality, time and space. That is why you have so much concern about the Shabbats, those pieces of time that God says belong to me, and about Shabbat. Which also means that if we really want to understand Sabbath, we have to first understand the importance of this land connection. Because in the presence of God, in God's holy district, in God's land, God's people have to be holy. It's as simple as that. All right, here's a couple of announcements for you. I will take a week off, as I normally do at the end of a series. So that's the end of Ezekiel. So next Friday, we will not meet. We will return on the 15th. So that's 2 weeks from today, and begin a new series with the book of Amos. So if you have time in the next 2 weeks, sit down and read the book of Amos. Pay attention to his style. Very unique. Okay, and so we will deal with Amos next. Okay. Any thought, any question? We're done with an amazing book that most Adventists know almost nothing about and probably have never studied, or maybe not even read in their lives, but a book that helps us to make sense of Revelation much more than any other book. And the understanding of how God has tied himself in time and space to our existence, to the existence of the human earth and the human race in particular. All right, any thought? Anybody? Any question? All right, I guess that means you are just like your students. I love about teaching is when you do ask people if they have thoughts or questions, that's when they get the most quiet. The rest of the period, they're pretty, those of you who are teaching high school, you know what I'm talking about. The rest of the time, they can be as rambunctious as possible. Pose a question and suddenly everyone goes quiet. But give it some thought. Think about how some of these prophecies actually impact how we should understand geopolitics at the moment. Okay, we can't run away from that reality either. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. Okay, let me stop the recording and then